Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're going to tackle a topic that's both fascinating and, I think, a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, I'd say so.
We're diving into the untold story of early Christianity. Um, More specifically, how it rose to power in the Roman Empire.
hmm
And, well, let's just say it wasn't always a peaceful transition.
Definitely not.
Now, the really interesting thing about this deep dive is the variety of sources we have.
It's a pretty unique mix.
We've got historical accounts, philosophical writings, even personal letters from people living through this tumultuous period. It's like getting a first-hand glimpse into history.
Yeah, I mean, that's what really brings it to life, doesn't it?
Totally. And it allows us to challenge some of the common assumptions about early Christianity.
Mm.
You know, the traditional narrative often paints the early church as a sort of savior of classical knowledge, especially during the so-called Dark Ages.
Right, like there were these guardians of ancient wisdom.
Exactly. But some of the sources, especially the book, tell a very different story, don't they?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. There's actually a shocking amount of destruction.
Yeah, like way more than just some random vandalism.
It was a calculated campaign. They wanted to wipe out competing ideologies. It's pretty intense when you think about it.
Temples were razed, libraries burned. I mean, countless works of philosophy and history just vanished.
It's hard to even fathom the scale of the loss.
And just imagine the scene at the Serapeum in Alexandria. That's where the remnants of the Library of Alexandria were housed. I mean, this was a magnificent temple holding what remained of, like, the greatest library in the world.
Reduced to rubble.
Just gone.
Yeah.
It's a stark symbol of what was lost.
Definitely.
Really makes you wonder what motivated such destruction. I mean, was it purely religious zeal? Or were there other factors involved, like power struggles or political maneuvering? What did the sources say about that?
Well, it seems like a really complex interplay of factors. I mean, you definitely have the genuine religious fervor, right? People who believed they were eradicating paganism. They thought they were, like, spreading the true faith.
I mean, that makes sense, right?
Sure, but on the other hand, there's evidence of some serious political opportunism going on, too. Individuals and factions using the rise of Christianity for their own gain.
Oh, so it's not as simple as good versus evil then?
Not even close. This was about human ambition, religious conviction, a clash of ideologies. And you have to imagine what it was like to live through that. I mean, talk about a confusing and frightening time.
I can't even imagine. Your whole worldview, everything you thought you knew about the gods and the universe,
Yeah.
just challenged overnight.
And the consequences for holding on to those old beliefs.
Yeah, they could be really, really dire.
For sure.
I mean, some of the sources mention Christian writers and preachers actively demonizing the old Roman and Greek gods,
Yeah.
portraying them as, like, literally demonic entities.
Right. That's got to create a climate of fear, like serious fear.
Definitely. And there's this one story that really stood out to me about a Christian who wrote to Augustine.
Oh, yeah. Augustine, huge figure in the early church.
Exactly. And this Christian was, like, super anxious about potential contamination from pagan stuff. They were even worried about using a chair a pagan had sat on.
I mean, that's anxiety on a whole other level.
Yeah, right. And get this, they even asked if it was okay to drink from a well in a deserted temple.
But just a regular well.
Yeah. And what was Augustine's response? Did he think those everyday things were actually a threat?
Oh, you know, Augustine, he was totally against it.
Seriously?
Yeah, he truly believed there was a real danger of contamination from anything associated with those old religions. I mean, can you imagine?
It's kind of wild how this whole idea of contamination extended beyond physical objects, though, right?
Mm.
Like, even ideas were considered dangerous.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's kind of similar to how the early church dealt with dissenting voices, even within their own ranks.
Like, even other Christians with different views.
Exactly. Take Celsus, for example.
Celsus, the early critic of Christianity.
Yeah, he really dissected their doctrines and questioned their whole claim of uniqueness. I mean, it was a serious challenge. Forced those early church leaders to confront some pretty fundamental questions about their beliefs.
So how'd they respond to that kind of criticism? Did they, like, engage in open debate?
Open debate, not so much.
Really?
Nope. They mostly just dismissed Celsus's arguments as unreasoning, and there were definitely attempts to suppress his work.
Wow. So it wasn't just Celsus they were targeting, right?
Yeah.
Like, did they try to censor other texts too?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Christian authorities were censoring and rewriting classical texts left and right. Anything they considered unacceptable, poof, gone.
So not just the overtly pagan stuff.
Nope. Even Ovid's poetry got caught in the crosshairs. You know Ovid, right?
Yeah, I mean, he was known for his, let's say, romantic themes.
Right. But it wasn't explicitly religious. Still, they had either heavily edited it or translated it into languages that were basically inaccessible to most people.
It's a little scary when you think about it. They weren't just trying to eliminate paganism, they were trying to control information.
And shape the moral landscape of society.
It's like Big Brother in togas.
Kinda, yeah.
And this control, this need for control, it's extended to their own followers too, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, figures like John Chrysostom were all about that. He was known for his fiery sermons, right?
Yeah, super intense.
He actually encouraged his congregations to spy on each other, like report anyone who deviated from Christian orthodoxy.
Whoa. So it wasn't enough to just convert people. You had to, like, conform completely.
Exactly. Conformity was key. They wanted to root out any little bit of heresy. It's crazy to think about how that must have felt.
It's like living in a constant state of fear and suspicion. Not just for pagans, but for Christians too.
That's the thing about power, right? It can be really seductive. And once you start down that path of control, it's hard to turn back.
It's interesting how this, like, obsession with purity and contamination, it even pops up when you look at the idea of martyrdom. We always hear about those noble martyrs, the ones who died for their faith under Roman persecution.
Right, like it was some kind of glorious sacrifice.
Exactly. But when you look at the sources, it's clear that things were a lot more complicated.
Oh, yeah, way more complicated. I mean, Roman persecution was definitely real at times, but it wasn't as constant or as widespread as a lot of people think.
So it wasn't like Christians were being hunted down and killed left and right.
No, not really. And the thing is, some Christians were actually eager to become martyrs.
Really? Like they were seeking it out.
It sounds crazy, but yeah. For some, death was like the ultimate act of piety, their ticket to heaven.
Like a guaranteed get-out-of-jail-free card.
Exactly. No matter what you'd done in the past, all your sins wiped clean.
So it was about more than just enduring suffering. It was about embracing death as proof of your faith.
Right. And that had huge social and spiritual implications. I mean, think about it. The church could use the promise of martyrdom to encourage obedience.
To keep people in line.
Exactly. Conformity was everything. And that focus on self-denial and piety, which started out as a personal thing.
Right, like an individual choice.
It gradually shifted to enforcing that same conformity on everyone else.
And that's when you start to see the rise of those powerful figures, right? Like Cyril of Alexandria, Shenut of Egypt.
Oh, yeah, those guys. They were like warlords. I mean, literally commanding militias. They used force to put down anyone who disagreed with them, inside the church or outside of it.
It's a pretty big leap from, like, quiet contemplation and personal piety to that kind of power.
It is, isn't it? And Shenut, man, that guy was intense. There's this story about him breaking into the house of a pagan.
Wait, a pagan?
Yeah, and get this, the guy's name was Jesus.
You can't make this stuff up.
I know, right? And Shenut just barged in there, destroyed all his idols, claimed God told him to do it, cleansed the land of paganism,
Right. And so the justification for violence, which initially was all about pagans, it expands, doesn't it?
It totally does. Anyone seen as a threat to the church, even other Christians, they were fair game.
And Augustine, his writings played a big part in that, didn't they?
Oh, yeah, for sure. He was the one who provided the theological framework for justifying violence. He argued that sometimes you need force to make people accept the truth.
Like for their own good.
Yeah.
To save their souls.
Exactly. Pretty heavy stuff, and it really had a lasting impact.
I mean, it shaped the relationship between religion and state for centuries.
No doubt about it.
It's scary how easily religious zeal can be used to justify that kind of thing. Violence, oppression. It makes you think about the dangers of absolute power,
Yeah.
Even when people think they're doing the right thing, acting on behalf of a higher authority.
That's the danger, isn't it? When you think you have all the answers.
It happens over and over again throughout history, right?
Oh, yeah, it's a recurring theme. You demonize the people who disagree with you, silence them, and then use force to impose your worldview. It's a cautionary tale for sure.
Yeah, definitely a cautionary tale. And speaking of which, the rise of monasticism during this time period is another piece of this whole story.
Oh, yeah, the monks.
I mean, the extreme asceticism, the isolation, it just seems so unimaginable to us today.
Think about St. Anthony. He gave up everything, his wealth, his whole life. Lived in a pigsty, then went out to the Egyptian desert for 20 years.
20 years. In the desert.
Fighting off demonic temptations, practicing extreme self-denial. Starvation, sleep deprivation, self-flagellation. They called it white martyrdom. a way to purify the soul, achieve spiritual transcendence.
It sounds almost like something out of a horror movie.
It's intense, that's for sure. But you have to try and understand the world they were living in. The Roman Empire was falling apart. There was chaos everywhere. People were afraid. For a lot of them, the world must have felt like it was ending.
So the monastic life, it was a way to escape all that.
In a way, yeah. Find order, purpose, a sense of control in a world that felt totally out of control.
And that need for order, for control, it's reflected in the rules they live by, isn't
Oh,
it?
absolutely. Those rules were super strict. They governed every aspect of life in the monastery. What they ate, how they dressed, when they prayed, even how they moved their bodies. No room for individuality.
It's like the ultimate conformity.
Right. And that need for control, it didn't stay confined to the monasteries. It started to spread outwards, influencing social norms and even politics.
Yeah.
The church was gaining power, real power.
They were challenging the authority of Rome.
They were a force to be reckoned with, and that's when they ran into another opponent, the last remnants of pagan intellectualism.
The philosophers.
The philosophers of Athens. They were the heirs to Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, a whole different way of thinking.
Reason, logic, knowledge for its own sake.
And the church, they saw that as a threat, a big one.
So let's talk about Damascus. He was the head of the Platonic Academy in Athens, right?
That's right. He and his fellow philosophers, they were basically the last holdouts against the rising tide of Christianity.
What was it like in Athens back then? Must have been a crazy time.
Oh yeah, super tense. Athens, the city known for its intellectual freedom, now it's caught between these two worldviews, these two forces battling it out.
And this wasn't just an intellectual debate, right? There were real consequences.
Absolutely. The philosophers were persecuted, the academy got shut down. Eventually, Damascus and his crew, they had to flee.
Into exile.
They ended up in the court of the Persian king, Khosrow I. Kind of ironic when you think about it.
How so?
Well, these philosophers, they're the heirs to classical Greece, right? And they have to seek protection from Persia, Rome's biggest rival.
Things had really changed. The center of intellectual gravity had, like, totally shifted. The old order was crumbling.
It was a whole new world.
But their story, it offers a bit of hope, doesn't it? I mean, they eventually got to go back to Athens. Khosrow helped negotiate their return.
Yeah, that's true. The church didn't have absolute control. There was still some pushback, other sources of power, and some respect for intellectual thought.
Like a tiny flame flickering in the darkness. Even when it seems like everything's lost, knowledge can find a way to survive.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about all those individual lives, right? Like, what was it like to be a pagan back then? I mean, your beliefs are suddenly illegal, your temples are being destroyed, your gods are considered demons.
Yeah, it must have been so disorienting. Everything you've always known, your whole world, just gone. Replaced by something completely foreign, maybe even hostile.
Like a cultural earthquake.
Exactly. And that kind of instability, it breeds fear, resentment, sometimes even violence.
Well, and some of the sources do mention pagans fighting back, right? Attacking churches, Christian symbols, even assassinating bishops.
Right. It wasn't just one-sided. There was resistance, even though in the end it didn't really change anything.
And I wonder how many of those conversions to Christianity were actually genuine. I mean, you have to imagine some people converted out of fear, right?
Oh, absolutely. Or to avoid persecution, or just to fit in. It's hard to know how many people truly believed versus how many were just going along with it.
It's like that story we talked about earlier. The Christian who is so worried about being contaminated by pagan objects. It just shows how much anxiety there was, this desperate need for certainty in a world that was changing so fast.
And I think that anxiety, that fear, it's a big part of why there was so much intolerance and violence. When people feel threatened, when their beliefs are challenged, they lash out.
It makes you wonder if we've really changed that much as humans.
That's the question, isn't it? I mean, we still see those same patterns today, don't we?
We sure do. People demonizing each other, silencing dissenting voices. It's like history repeating itself.
The tools may be different, but the underlying impulses, yeah, they're still there.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's a reflection of who we are. By studying it, maybe we can learn from the mistakes of those who came before us.
Exactly. The story of early Christianity, it's a cautionary tale about power, about the dangers of thinking you have all the answers, and about how easily good intentions can go wrong.
But it's also a story of resilience, about the power of ideas to endure, and about how the human spirit, it's capable of both incredible good and incredible evil.
And sometimes a little bit of both at the same time, like those philosophers from Athens, forced into exile, silenced. But their ideas, they eventually came back. Centuries later, they helped shape the Renaissance and Western thought as we know it.
That's pretty amazing when you think about it. Even when it seems like everything's lost, knowledge finds a way.
It does. It always does.
So what does all this mean for us today?
Hmm.
I mean, we're living in a pretty crazy time, too. Lots of uncertainty, lots of division.
Yeah, it can feel overwhelming sometimes. But I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that we need to be more critical, more compassionate, and more courageous.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we need to be willing to question our own assumptions, to really listen to people who disagree with us, and to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's hard.
To fight for intellectual freedom, for tolerance, for the right to think differently.
Exactly. Those fights are never truly over. And we all have a part to play in creating a future where knowledge is valued, diversity is celebrated, and everyone is free to explore new ideas.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the untold story of early Christianity. We hope you learned something new and maybe even had your thinking challenged a little bit.
That's what it's all about.
If you're interested in learning more about this topic, we highly recommend checking out by Catherine Nixie. She really digs deep into the complexities of early Christianity. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.